Well, it's good to be back with y'all this week. Mike and I are going to cover the events leading up to chapter 1 Samuel chapter 19. I'm going to give a little bit of the background, but before we get started, we're going to do Ron Penny's Sunday School in 7 minutes that covers this week's lesson.
Now let's start out this lesson by saying that Saul was an insecure leader. As king, he was more than commander-in-chief. He was the hands-on leader of the army. While he understood that he needed subordinate leaders to help defeat his nation's enemies, he disliked sharing any of the credit with those leaders. Saul demanded loyalty, and at the slightest sign of what he imagined to be disloyalty or sedition, he would unleash vengeful words and violent acts towards those who he distrusted. David is included in this need you but don't trust you, really hate you relationship. In 1 Samuel 18 and 19, Saul tries to kill David at least 12 times. Without intending to do so, David's fame grew, and his wisdom, undoubtedly a product of the Spirit, became well known. He was a man of high esteem, considered one of the best commanders around. Some leaders want good leaders around them, but Saul is not one of them. He feared those good leaders around him, and abandoning his cloak and dagger tactics, Saul now orders his servants, including Jonathan, his son, to kill David. After David had bravely slayed Goliath, Jonathan had made a covenant with David, which he certainly didn't intend to break now. But more than that covenant, Jonathan and David had a bond of brotherly love, philia love. Protecting David is more than Jonathan's duty. Jonathan delighted in David. He was truly in love with David, just as he loved himself. Now, Jonathan wants to reverse his father's orders. If he needs to, Jonathan is willing to violate that command, but he would rather reason with his father to have his father revoke the order. Jonathan first warns David, informing him of his father's orders, and he urges David to be on guard and to hide himself until he can speak to his father. Strangely, he tells David he will be meeting with his father in the very same area where David is to hide. In addition, he promises to report the outcome of his discussions to David. Jonathan's dealings with his father on behalf of David are a model of trying to seek a win-win-win solution. First, we find here an example of a friend who loves his neighbor as himself. Confronting Saul, pushing back against Saul, is dangerous business, and yet Jonathan does it. Second, Jonathan subordinates himself and his own personal interests in the throne to those of David. And third, Jonathan is a faithful and submissive son to his father. He approaches his father directly, speaks to him with respect. He speaks well of David. He appeals for David's life on one hand because of his friendship with David, but on the other hand, he appeals to his father to do what is in his own best interest, his father's own best interest. He reminds Saul that David is the most faithful and devoted servant whose actions have always benefited Saul. He also reminds his father that when David killed Goliath, Saul himself rejoiced in David's victory because it was Saul's victory as well. To be hostile against David would not be just or wise, and even worse, it would be a sin, for he would be shedding innocent blood. For the moment, Saul is persuaded by Jonathan's reasoning. He swears that as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. The fundamental, however, insecurities of Saul still exist. Like us, sometimes we can be persuaded not to act in our anger, but that decision does not change the feelings that led to the anger. Like modern Christians, Saul is still harboring distrust because of his jealousy. Thus, his promise will not last. Jonathan calls David and tells him about the meeting with his father, and the outcome then brings him back to his father's presence. For a short time, at least, things look like they used to look. But there is a thin line between trust and hate, and once that line is erased, it is hard to restore. Jonathan and David had a trusting brotherly relationship that was unconditional. Saul's relationship with David was more like a cost-benefit analysis. Saul needed David as a loyal and skillful warrior, but if David posed any threat to Saul's grasp on power, that need was outweighed by the potential harm David could bring to Saul's reign. David became a liability to the king. What we see here is a relationship that sounds a little like modern-day couples staying together because of their financial arrangements. If the finances become troublesome, the relationship becomes expendable. That's the lesson for this week. Have a great week. Bye.
Today's lesson reminds us that the plans of God take place over time. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, which is a little background, we have Hannah, who grieved over the fact that she had no child. So Hannah went to the temple and made a vow. Lord, if you will answer my prayer and give me a son, I will give him back to you for his entire lifetime. The Lord granted her request, and a boy was born. He was named Samuel, which means asked of God. Hannah and her husband loved and guided the boy until he was 3 or 4 years old. Then they took him to the temple to live with the old priest, Eli. His parents visited him periodically, but they understood that the boy belonged to the Lord. God did great things with Samuel. He grew up to be one of Israel's greatest prophets. Remember, it was Samuel who took a vial of oil one day following God's command and anointed a shepherd boy named David to be the king of Israel. The story of Hannah teaches us 3 great truths that all of us as parents and grandparents should know and remember. Every child is a unique gift from God. This was so obvious in Samuel's case. What a challenge it is to treat a child as special and unique without spoiling or indulging him. The second principle that we see in that first part of first chapter of 1 Samuel is that we have much to teach our children and really so little time. Hannah had Samuel for only 3 or 4 years. The experts tell us that most of the training we give our children will be finished by the time they're 6 years old. So much to teach in terms of values, wisdom, and faith, and so little time to do it. And the last lesson from that first chapter of 1 Samuel is that the greatest thing you can do for a child is to loan him to the Lord. There are some persons who consider themselves model parents. They provide their children with the best of food, clothing, and medical care. They give them the latest toys. They attend their recitals and Little League ball games. But these children never hear their parents call their names in prayer. These parents never read to them from the Bible. Church has no part in their lifestyle. Just like in our story, one day God is going to demand an accounting from these parents. The Lord is going to ask, why did you leave out the most important training of all? Why did you train your child to ignore me? What does it profit a child to attend Harvard and make $1 million before he's 30 if in the process he loses his eternal soul? What can the world possibly give that will make up for the absence of God? In today's lesson, young David was minding his own business while watching his father's sheep on the outskirts of Bethlehem when he was summoned by the prophet Samuel, who anointed him as the next king of Israel. A short time later, David was conscripted into King Saul's service. It was not long, however, before Saul became insanely jealous of David and tried to have him killed on a multitude of occasions. Yet through all his difficulties, David entrusted himself to God's providential care. The story of David is the story of a shepherd defending the holy flock of the Lord. But it is the Lord who saves them. For God is the true shepherd of Israel. The story of David and Goliath is a story about a predator, prey, and prayer. Israel is the flock. The Philistines are the predators who threatened Israel for 40 straight days. Goliath is a vicious and violent beast. He's not merely uncircumcised, but is dedicated to killing Israel's entire flock, God's people. Saul's entire army of Israelites clearly feared the aggressive brute whom David equates to both lion and bear in his past experience. Interested only in killing and consuming, Goliath is donned in heavy armor with spear, sword, and javelin, weapons of aggression, weapons of the world. David uses his skill as a shepherd to create a new battlefield for God to defeat this invading enemy. With the power of God behind him, David slays the aggressor with one smooth stone. That stone was one of 5 smooth stones chosen by David from the nearby flowing brook. Oh, the power of that one smooth stone. A future built on a rock. Truly, the mighty word of God. For it is God who defeats Goliath, puts an end to the predator, just as David explains. It is God who saves God's people from the claws and paws of the beast Goliath. God is undefeatable. Only faith can restore humanness. It's not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, said David, but God saves through restoration. Those who refuse to be restored invite their own destruction. The armor of God is the Word of God, which to us we all need to maintain in our relationship with God. We need nothing more. Skipping to a later point in the life of David, we meet Jonathan, King Saul's son, who has essentially abdicated his right to rule as the next king over Israel, and has privately committed himself to David in a bond of covenant friendship. The bond was about to be tested. Jonathan told David, "Saul, my father seeks to kill you. Therefore be on your guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself. I will go out and stand before my father in the field where you are, and I will speak to my father about you. And if I learn anything, I will tell you." Jonathan, in effect, volunteered to be the go-between between David and Saul. By going to Saul and speaking to him on David's behalf, Jonathan was doing something very risky. He did not know how Saul would react to a plea on David's behalf, but he was willing to take the risk. Moreover, Jonathan had thought carefully about what he would say to Saul. Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, "Let not the king sin against his servant David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his deeds have brought great good to you. For he took his life in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine. And the Lord worked a great salvation for all of Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause?" Jonathan courageously told his father that the king would sin if he killed David. Surprisingly, Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan. In fact, Saul swore, "As the Lord lives, David shall not be put to death." For the time, disaster has been averted. Saul had fallen from God's graces and was destined to be replaced by God's new anointed choice, David. Shortly after that, Jonathan will die on the battlefield along with his father, the king. David will take the throne. But first he will mourn. He mourns the loss of the king, and he mourns the loss of his best friend. Life is not a straight line, leading from one blessing to the next, and then finally to heaven. Life is a winding, troubled road. The point of the biblical stories like Joseph and Job, Esther and Ruth, David and Jonathan, is to help us feel in our bones, not just know in our heads, that God is with us and for us in all these strange twists and turns. God is not just showing up after the trouble and cleaning it up. He is plotting the course and manage the troubles with far-reaching purposes for our good and the glory of Jesus Christ.
This lesson is all about love and covenant. What we finally, ultimately need to remember from this lesson is that love makes promises, and having made them, keeps them. Now, God showed us how this was done. I want you to listen to this one little set of verses from Deuteronomy 7. "It was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love upon you and chose you. For you were the fewest of all peoples. But it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath which he swore to your fathers. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations." That's why we really can't end the story of David and the covenant between he and Jonathan with the end of 1 Samuel. We really have to go on to 2 Samuel chapter 9. And that's where we run into the story of Mephibosheth. Now I know if you're like me or Chuck and you hear the name Mephibosheth, you just want to say, Mephibosheth who? Well, I'll tell you. Jonathan, if you'll remember, died in battle with his father. Never became king. And what happened to his family after his death? Well, all we know is that one son, Mephibosheth, survived. His nurse was carrying him as they tried to escape from Jerusalem just ahead of the advancing army. And she was trying to reach shelter in the caves of Lodabar. Now, Lodabar is, well, the closest word we would have to match it in our culture around here would be the boonies. They were going so far out that no one would mess with them. There were caves out there. They could seek shelter from the sun and from animals in these caves, and ultimately find a more permanent place to reside in this wilderness. Now this young boy, Mephibosheth, was Jonathan's only surviving son, and on the way out of town, the nurse dropped him on the pavement, and what we're told is that he was crippled in that fall. And that's the word the Bible uses. It's an ugly word. We don't use it much anymore. We'll use words like differently abled or physically challenged, but the Bible, the old versions, refer to him as a cripple. And being a cripple in the time of the kingdom carried with it a handicap more severe than just not being able to run or walk or play with the other kids like everyone else. The Torah itself, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, ordered that the presence of any significant physical defect, anyone who had the presence of one of those, were banned from ever entering the temple. Imagine that. It's like being cut off from God just because your nurse had an accident and dropped you and you were crippled by her actions. It wasn't your fault. You haven't really changed any except that you just have trouble walking. But under the Torah, he was banned from the temple. If there had been a synagogue out at Lodabar, he would have been banned from it as well. If he had had sufficient money and wherewithal to open a business, no one would have patronized his trade or his business. He never probably would have had a wife or children of his own. By the grace of God, he did have a child, Micah. But it's a little wonder that living in the isolation of Lodabar became a lonely but welcome place to live, because there he could escape the whispers and the insults. Now the years would pass, and David would defeat first one enemy and then another. But then the day came when God's promise to David that he would defeat all of Israel's enemies and peace would finally descend upon David and the nation of Israel would come true. And he finally had a moment to think about something other than fighting. And that was when he remembered the promise that he had made to Jonathan. Jonathan had said, if I live in this battle to come, and you escape, we will remain friends forever. If, however, I am killed in battle, promise me that you will look after my family as your own forever. Well, he remembered that promise that he had made to Jonathan. Now, in the midst of his new life, David suddenly remembered a promise from his old one. And he asked, is there anyone still left from the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? In his newfound peace, he has a moment to think and to remember his friend Jonathan, who had risked his life more than once for David. And he remembered that promise that he had made. When Saul threatened to kill him, Jonathan sought to save him. And Jonathan succeeded and made this request: if I make it through this alive, continue to be my covenant friend. But if I die, keep the covenant friendship with my family forever. And sure enough, Jonathan died. But David's promise did not. No one would have thought twice about letting it go. David had so many reasons to forget the vow that he had made to Jonathan. After all, it was Saul who had tried so hard to kill him. And when the promise was made, he and Jonathan were so young and idealistic. Who really keeps all the promises they made in their youth? Saul was cruel and relentless. Who honors the children of an old enemy? David has a nation to rule and an army to lead. What king has time for such trivialities? But to David, a covenant is no small matter. When you catalog the giants David faced, you be sure you remember that the word promise survives the cut and makes the short list. It certainly appears on most lists of big but important challenges for us. The husband of a depressed wife knows the challenge of a promise. As she daily stumbles through a gloomy fog, he wonders what happened to that young girl full of joy that he married. Should you really be expected to keep a promise in a time like that? Or the wife of a cheating husband asks the same. He says he's back, he's sorry, but still she hurts and she wonders, he broke his promise once, why should I keep mine? Parents have asked such questions. Parents of prodigals, parents of runaways, parents of addicts, parents of severely handicapped and disabled children. Promises are made in the early days of summer when the living is easy, but they are usually cashed in the bitter cold of winter. When it becomes a little more than a struggle just to survive, we never escape their shadow. And like God, David, it seems, didn't attempt to. Ziba was a former servant of Saul, and he was now a servant in David's house, and he was summoned to the throne room. And he was asked, did he happen to know of a surviving member of Saul's household? And how did Ziba answer? Well, yeah, one of Jonathan's sons is still alive. Notice he doesn't give even the name of the child, but he's sure to add the qualifier on the end. But he's a cripple. He who scatters shame. That's what Mephibosheth means. Ziba's reply insinuates, are you sure you want to invite someone like that into your palace? My God, he can't even go to the temple. It's been 15 years, but David is still sure. Servants drive the equivalent of a stretch limousine and motorcade across the Jordan River, and they knock on the door of the shack in which he lives. And they explain their business. They load Mephibosheth into the car, this big camel, and carry him into the palace. The boy assumes the worst. He knew that his father had died with his grandfather fighting David. And he enters the presence of David with the enthusiasm of a death row inmate entering the room for lethal injections. The boy bows low and asks, who am I that you pay attention to a dead dog like me? Then David called Ziba, Saul's right-hand man, and told him, everything that belonged to Saul and his family, I am giving over to your master's grandson, and from now on, he will eat at my table with the rest of my family as a son. Now, David he could have sent money to Lodabar. He could have sent a lifelong annuity of sorts and generously provided for all the boy's needs and would have fulfilled his promise. But David gave Mephibosheth more than a pension. He gave him a place at the royal table and, in effect, made him a part of his own family. The kid who had no legs to stand on now has everything to live for. And why? Because of David. Not because he convinced him, not because he impressed him or coerced him. Mephibosheth did nothing. It was a promise that prompted David. The king is kind, not because the boy is deserving, but because the promise offered in love is always intended to endure. Were we able to ask David how he fulfilled his giant promise, he would take us from his story to God's story. Because let's face it, God sets the standard for covenant keeping. When God made a covenant, if you remember the covenant that he made with Abraham, he had animals. He had Abraham take several perfect animals, cut them right down the middle, and lay them apart. And then in the darkness, God walked in between them with a smudge pot. Just a little bit of light and lots of smoke. And the implication was this: if I break the covenant that I make with you this day, may what has been done to these animals be done to me. So it was a very serious matter. Now you can consider the case of Hosea if you want to. 700 years before the birth of Jesus, God commanded Hosea to marry a prostitute named Gomer. Still, Hosea obeyed. And Gomer gave birth to 3 children, none of whom were his. And Gomer abandoned Hosea for a life in the sex trade. Rock bottom came in the form of an auction pit where men would bid on her as a slave. You want to see a picture of our promise-keeping God? Look at Hosea buying back his wife. Or look at the rainbow. That was the sign of the covenant that God had made with Noah. Or today, we'll just look at Mephibosheth. You've never introduced yourself as Mephibosheth from Lodabar, but you could. You remember the details of his disaster? He was born a rightful heir to the throne, crippled by a fall, left with useless feet in a foreign land where he lived under the threat of death. Whether you realize it or not, that's your story. Because you were born the child of a king. And you were left hobbling because of the stumble of Adam and Eve. Who among us hasn't meandered along the parched earth of dried up riverbeds at Lodabar? But then came the palace messenger. Maybe for you it was a 4th grade teacher, a high school buddy or an aunt, maybe a preacher or a Sunday school teacher. They came with big news and a waiting limo, saying, you are not going to believe this, but the king of Israel is offering you a place at his table. The place card is printed and the chair is empty. He wants you to join his family. Not because of your IQ, not because of your looks, not because of your money, and certainly not for your sense of humor. I hate to tell you this, but your invitation has nothing to do with you and everything to do with God. Your eternal life is covenant caused, covenant secured, and covenant based. It's built on a promise. Now, you can put Lodabar behind you for one reason. God keeps His promises. Now, shouldn't God's promise inspire us to keep ours? And we are to keep ours so that we can teach others the importance of covenant and making promises and keeping promises by letting them watch us set a good example. That's really what God's asking us to do. To illustrate that love will not let us go. A stubborn love is based on nothing more than a promise. Just by coming to Sunday school and worship and Wednesday nights, God is giving you a Mephibosheth-sized chance to show your children, your friends, and even strangers what real love does. So embrace it. And who knows, someday someone may tell the story of how you kept your promise to love God and the Mephibosheths of your world, even as God has never forgotten His promise to love you with a love that will not let you go. That's our closing hymn for today. It's done by the Gaither Family Band. It's an a cappella arrangement and is really beautiful and should serve as a reminder of God's love for us and the love that we are to have for others. Y'all have a great week. We enjoyed being with you this morning. May God bless you and keep you always.
Oh, love that will not let me go. I rest my weary soul in Thee. I give Thee back the life I owe. That in Thine ocean depths its flow may richer, fuller be. O love that will not let me go. O joy that seekest me through pain. I cannot close my heart to Thee. I trace the rainbow through the rain and feel the promise is not vain, that morn shall tearless be. O love that will not let me go. Cross that liftest up my head. I dare not ask to fly from Thee. I lay in dust life's glory.